Okay, welcome, morning everyone, and welcome to our Audit Committee meeting. Welcome to Councillor Colley, our new Vice Chair. I assume you know everyone. Fiona, or do we need to do some introductions? Great. Okay, do we have any apologies this morning? Not hearing you, Dave.
Oh, I don't believe there are any apologies, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, any declarations of interest in relation to any of today's items? I'm seeing the shaking of heads, so I'll take that as a no. Can we move on then to the minute of our last meeting from 11th of March? We'll go through it for accuracy. Is there anything on what in the papers is page 3, 4, 5, and 6? Okay, can we take then that as an accurate record? Are there any matters arising that won't come up anywhere else on the agenda this morning? No. Okay, we move on then to item 4, which is the strategic risk register. Stephen, are you taking us through this?
Yes, please. Thank you, Gordon. Well, good morning, everyone. Agenda item 4 is the strategic risk register. You will see in the paper that no new risks have been added to the register since the last version was presented to committee back in March, and consequently there remain 9 live risks. 8 are currently considered high risk and 1 is classed as medium risk. The paper itself reminds us that the IJB is responsible for implementing a governance framework and system of internal controls, and as part of that framework, the strategic risk register identifies material risks that cannot be mitigated to an acceptable standard. Table 4.1, the table in section 4.1 presents a summary of the 9 active risks on the risk register, starting with funding and demographic pressures through to resilience, business control, and then primary care. The table shows current risk rating with current controls in place and a target risk rating after further actions. Current and target risk ratings are based on assessment of each risk using the scoring matrix that can be found in Appendix 1. This considers various risk categories, the likelihood of each risk occurring, and its impact. Using this matrix, there are currently high 8 risks and 1 medium risk. Section 4.2 of the report provides a link to the detailed risk register. This considers each risk in greater detail, rating each risk first of all without any controls, that's the untreated score, with current controls, the current risk score, and with further controls required, that being the target risk score. Current and proposed future controls are listed along with a risk owner and the target completion date for each action. The last review date is also noted on the spreadsheet. Back to the main paper itself. The paper highlights a meeting that took place on the 3rd of May between NHS Forth Valley, ourselves, and Clacton Stirling Integration Joint Board colleagues. The meeting was to progress residual integration actions, and a renewed action plan is currently being prepared. Finally, in section 5 is the conclusions, and that includes the risk implications associated with this report. The committee is asked to consider and comment on both the high-level summary and the detailed strategic risk register. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. So no substantial changes to the risk, although 4.3 does note that the action plan there will include a review of risks around integration, and that will come back to us at a future meeting. So we'll perhaps leave that one for now. Any members have any questions or comments on the report? Fiona.
Yeah, thanks, and I apologise for my. It's been a while since I've been on the audit committee, so I just wanted to maybe get a little bit of I suppose I've got a bit of concern that we've got so many in high. I can see that and from the more detailed register that with actions that there's a number of them do fall to low. But there are some that even with actions are remaining high. Assurance might be one, for example, or I suppose still at medium. And I wondered if maybe someone could comment on if there's anything further that we might be able to do to try and alleviate some of those risks. And I recognise that some of them, like funding and demographic pressures, are external and not necessarily something that we have a great deal of control over, though how we respond to them is something that we do.
Yeah, it's a fair point. There are a fair number that are sitting at high, which isn't a great position to be in. Tony, do you want to come in on that specific point?
Well, I wouldn't want to cut across Patricia, but I think the point, as you'll see from the report later, and that report was written some time ago now, but I think a lot of the messages are still extant. You're about to embark on a new strategic commissioning plan, and that will, I think, help you identify, because I think one of the points we made in our report was that we need almost a fundamental review of the risk register reset. So in terms of the risks being high, that's what's happening at the moment in the real world, and your risk register is a reflection of the real world. And in fact, I've seen risk registers that are higher than that, probably in similar circumstances. And I think it's important that you recognise that fact. It's important that as an audit committee you don't get blasé about it, but that is the environment in which we operate. The inherent risks, the risks that we're facing are extremely high. And probably the one that I don't see as overtly in there as I do elsewhere is probably workforce. And I think everyone would recognise that workforce is a massive issue. Obviously not for you directly, because you don't employ. There's an argument about how many staff an IJB employs. It's possibly one, possibly two, possibly none. But yeah, in terms of the impact of all of the pressures on workforce for all of your providers, not just the Health Board and Council, but the third sector, the private sector, all of those are facing significant workforce challenges. So actually, that sort of risk profile is what you would expect. And what's really important is that you understand the actions that are going to be taken to mitigate that. And a lot of those should come out of your strategic plan. So there's a really symbiotic relationship between the new strategic plan and your risk register. The risk register informs your strategic priorities. But when you've got your strategic priorities, those should be reflected in your risk register, because they're the most important things. So so I think, in a sense, I think the risk register it's not unreasonable, the scores there. My suspicion is that when you've done that full process and looked at the horror show that's out there at the moment, I'm afraid it's not necessarily going to look any less red. That's and that would be right, because it's got to reflect what's happening. And the important thing is that you focus on the things that will add the most value in terms of getting those risks down. And as you'll see from our report, that you get assurance that those things are happening and are effective. So I think, and the short answer is, yeah, it's red, and yes, it should be, because that's what's happening. And that wouldn't be different from other IJBs and indeed our local authority and health board partners.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. And under risk 4 capacity and infrastructure, that's where staffing issues would come in, and that is sitting at high. So yeah, that just kind of shows the point you make. Patricia, sorry, I thought Tony was responding directly to Fiona's comments. I brought them in before you.
No problem. I concur with what Tony is saying. We are working in a really high risk environment, and it's keeping a pace with those emerging risks as well as a continued risk. So we are undertaking a review of the strategic risk register alongside our health and the other IJB in Forth Valley, and there's been an agreement to look at the alignment of the risk registers across both IJBs and the NHS board. So that piece of work is underway. Tony makes a good point, and we're working on the submission of the 3-year workforce plan. We've got a session next week with government colleagues to look at that. That's a critical planning document for us, given the level of risk and the challenges we have around recruitment and retention, and absolutely that needs to align to the strategic plan, but also a refresh of the medium-term financial plan. So those are 3 important planks of our planning for delivery over the next few years. So Tony makes good points in that regard. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Tony, is that a legacy hand, or did you want to come back in? Okay, yeah, I take the point that there are lots of reds, and that probably is where we should be right now. So we'll certainly, as always, keep the risk register under close review at each meeting. Thanks, colleagues. Item 5 then is the internal audit annual assurance. Isabel.
Morning, everybody. So the report you've got here is the 21-22 internal audit annual assurance report. The purpose of the report is to summarise the work that internal audit has undertaken over the course of the last year and to provide an overall opinion on the IJB's arrangements for risk management, governance and control based on that work. The report also comments on our compliance with public sector internal audit standards. As you can see from section 2, the IJB Audit Committee is asked to note that sufficient internal audit work was undertaken to support a balanced assurance, and the internal audit can provide substantial assurance on the IJB's arrangements for risk management, governance and control for the year to 31st of March 2022. Section 3 of the report explains that the 21-22 internal audit plan set out 2 main assignments to be completed by the team over the course of the year. Paragraph 3.6 specifically provides a summary of those 2 assignments within the scope, and the findings arising from the finalised directions assignment is set out at Appendix 1. The assurance opinion is strengthened by each of the Falkirk Council and the NHS Forth Valley reports that we're taking reliance from. These are at paragraphs 3.9 and 3.10 respectively. Section 4 of the report comments on the compliance with the public sector internal audit standards. These set out the principles and practices that we must comply with, and every year we are required to undertake a self-assessment against the standards. This has given reassurance that we operate in line with those standards. It was undertaken by internal audit during February 2022. There's also a 5-year external assessment, which the section last underwent during 2018, and we were found to be compliant with that too. So I'd ask the board to note the conclusions at section 5. I'm happy to try and answer any questions you've got, but one thing just before we go to that, this is actually my last audit committee as the outgoing internal audit manager, and you've already met Tony, and Tony is the incoming internal audit manager. So you have this report as the annual assurance report for 21-22. Tony will be bringing the internal audit plan for 22-23, I assume, to the next audit committee, just to give you a bit of context where we're at. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. Yeah, and the phrase substantial assurance is always a good one to see in an audit report from my perspective. So thank you for the report. Anyone have any questions or comments? No. Robert.
Yeah, it's just around the directions, and there's a bit in it that says that we're not getting responses from NHS Forth Valley or the local authorities when directions are issued. I'm just wondering if that's been rectified so that we can hold them to account if we need to, saying that they're not doing the direction.
It was a recommendation in there to take that forward, so I'm not sure what the current status is. Maybe Patricia could come in with that.
It's something which I discussed with Gillian before Stephen came into post, so I'll need to chase that up with Stephen just to check if that's been done, but thanks for highlighting that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One item there outstanding then. Right, if there's nothing else, then we'll move on to item 6, which is the unaudited accounts. Stephen, I think you're taking us through this one.
Yes, thank you. So this is the bulk of the papers actually. Agenda item 6 is the unaudited accounts, and the report presents the 2021-22 unaudited accounts to the audit committee for consideration. The accounts will remain in draft form until external audit process has been completed. And just in section 3 of the report, just a bit of background, it notes that under local authority accounts regulations, the accounts must be submitted to the external auditor by the 30th of June 2022, and the IJB or a committee of the IJB whose remit includes audit and governance must meet to consider the unaudited annual accounts. The accounts themselves must be available for public inspection for a 3-week period, and following public notice on the 27th of May, that period started here on the 10th of June 2022. The accounts will be lodged with external audit after today's meeting, and it's anticipated that the audited accounts will be presented for approval by the IJB Audit Committee on the 23rd of September 2022, in compliance with the statutory deadline of the 30th of September. In terms of the accounts themselves, these can be found in Appendix 1. And I have to say, if you're reading from printed papers today, I can only apologise for the double numbering that you're going to see. Page 1 of the annual accounts is page 28 of today's papers, and throughout the annual accounts you will see that double numbering. So I hope that's not too confusing. Both a management commentary and a governance statement form part of the unaudited accounts, and the reporting requirement for the management commentary are prescribed in legislation must include an explanation of key financial components, a clear and balanced account of activities and performance, and an explanation of principal risks and uncertainties. The governance statement details key risks of the governance framework and outlines the effectiveness of the system of internal controls. So the Audit Committee is asked to consider the unaudited annual accounts, note the public inspection period, and note the unaudited accounts will be submitted to external audit by the statutory deadline of the 30th of June. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I made the point at the IJB meeting that the reserves position perhaps looks a little strange because the reserves, which were very high last year, are almost double that this year. So I'm pleased to see there's a really clear explanation in there of exactly why that is. Thank you for that. Any comments or questions? Nope. Okay, so it will be over to you and your team now, Grace, and we'll see the audited version of the accounts back in September when you've finished your work. Okay, if there's nothing else, then we'll move on when I walk my way through the papers to item 7. Which is the annual assurance statement. Is that yourself again, Stephen?
Yes, yeah, I'm sorry you're going to hear a lot of my voice this morning. So not to be confused with the internal audit annual assurance that we considered already, this paper considers the audit committee itself and the audit committee's annual assurance statement. Annual assurance statements are prepared by all IJB committees in order to provide assurance that the committee structure supports delivery of strategic priorities, and ensure that operational and strategic risks are being effectively managed. The statements in line with internal audit recommendations, and once approved will be presented to the IJB for noting. The assurance statement itself is provided in Appendix 1, page 79, in the form of the annual report of the Integration Joint Board Audit Committee. This notes the functions delegated to the Audit Committee, membership, meeting dates during the last financial year, and attendance, along with items of business at each meeting. Those are listed in Appendix 2. Section 4 of the annual report of the Audit Committee are the conclusions, providing assurance to the IJB today. Today, Audit Committee is asked to approve the annual assurance statement contained within the appendix. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Seemed fairly straightforward to me. I didn't have any particular issues with it. Does anyone else wish to raise anything? Fiona?
Yeah, just a quick question in relation to the non-voting members, and I know that someone had been intended to be on it, and that there'd been a change of staff within the third sector, and I wondered, and I apologise if this has already been discussed, in relation to identifying another non-voting member from the IJB board.
Patricia, do you have any update on that?
Thank you. I believe that Suzanne is working on that in the background. I don't know, David, if you have any more recent update on that, but we'll certainly bring that back to the next audit committee. Thank you.
Oh, I've got nothing to add on that, Patricia. I think you summarised the position well.
Okay, thank you. We'll look forward to that. All right, can we agree the report then for forwarding on to IJB? Thank you. Item 8 then is the National Audit Report and Inspection Overview. Stephen?
Yes, thank you. So just very briefly, this item is presented for consideration and comment, and it lists the most recent national reports to be considered by the Audit Committee. Section 4.1 is a short table that summarises the 4 national reports for consideration. NHS in Scotland 2021, addressing climate change, drug and alcohol services, and local government financial overview, being the 4 reports. Section 5.1 summarises the 3 inspection reports that are also considered by the Clinical Care Governance Committee, a report each for Central, East and West localities. And the Audit Committee is asked to consider and comment on the content of this report.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Any comments? No, I'm not seeing any hands, so we will note those reports. Thank you. Item 9 then is Governance Statement Improvement Actions.
Okay, so the governance statement is one of the sections within each year's annual accounts, as you probably noticed earlier, and highlights improvement actions recommended through the audit process. This report provides an update on progress with various improvement actions identified through the annual governance statements, arising from various internal and external audit recommendations. It was agreed at a previous audit committee that regular updates on governance statement improvement actions would be provided as a standing item. As matters are just now, there are 11 live improvement actions, and these can be found and are listed in Appendix 1. And the table in Appendix 1 also shows the responsible officer, target completion date, and current status. Item 9 refers to a self-assessment against best value guidance, and that is now complete. This will be removed from the next update. There's been progress on other actions with set-aside considerations, and the risk management action plan is next on today's agenda. Other items you will see have been delayed, and that's largely linked to the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and the associated capacity challenges. And so the Audit Committee is asked to note the progress made with the identified improvement actions. Thank you.
Thank you. So there has been some progress made, which is good. I think just because there were a number of items that were delayed for the obvious reasons, as you say, we just wanted to keep a check that progress was being made. So it's good that at least one is ticked off and another one is on today's agenda. So there is progress there. Thank you. Again, any questions or comments, colleagues? No. Can we note that report then? Thank you, Stephen. And we'll move on to item 10, which, as you say, is the risk management.
Thank you. So action 10, agenda item 10, I beg your pardon, is the action plan arising from the internal audit of risk management arrangements. The paper presents the findings of the internal audit review and presents an action plan to address a number of recommendations. The IJB is subject to internal audit as part of its financial management and internal control arrangements. The review of IJB's risk management arrangements was carried out as part of the agreed internal audit work plan, and an initial report from internal audit was presented back in December 2021 to the Audit Committee. The report provided limited assurance and outlined several key improvement actions, and we can see those summarised in section 4.2. An action plan to respond to the internal audit recommendations can be found in Appendix 2 of the document. This contains the proposed response to each of the 6 recommendations. Each of these proposed responses includes a lead and the proposed action, along with target dates for delivery of the first phase actions. The action plan was taken just last Friday, actually, to the IJB senior leadership team, and it's been produced. It's worth noting it's been produced in collaboration with both Hugh Coyle and Sarah Mackenzie, the risk management experts within the Falkirk Council and NHS Forth Valley. For the committee is asked today, the Audit Committee is asked to note the findings of the internal audit report and to approve the action plan presented in Appendix 2.
Thanks, Stephen. So limited assurance, not as good as substantial assurance, of course, but there is the plan in place. I think for a while now we have talked about bringing the 3 risk management partners, if you like, together. So it's good that that work is now going on. Again, I know there were delays on that because of staff leaving and the like. So it's good to see that that is now progressing, and we will see that in future. Any questions or comments? No. Are we happy to agree the report, Fiona?
Yeah, sorry, just one question
Sure.
around the development of risk appetite, and I see that there's around joint workshops around the senior the leadership team. I'll get that words out. And I know that Gordon Noble and Robert will recognise that some work done at the health code around the wider membership and risk appetite, and obviously this is maybe a little bit further down the line, but for that sort of wider IJB board membership, perhaps around some of the development activities, it might. I'm just putting it out there, and not saying that's something we should definitely do, but maybe something we should consider.
Yeah, I think it should be on the list of things that need looked at some stage. I think it is very helpful to have that discussion around the level of risk that the board is prepared to tolerate. So I think that is a useful discussion to have. Tony?
Thanks, Chair. In terms of that risk appetite discussion, yeah, I mean, Not everything goes in the report, but it is important that the board itself approves the risk appetite statement when it's finally. Probably best practice is to have people involved before that point, so you can have kind of offline discussions. You know, a board isn't the place to have perhaps some of those more nuanced discussions. I think the most important thing though is the so what question, because a lot of people can produce a risk appetite statement and it sits in a drawer. The important thing, and I've worked with quite a few IJB clients elsewhere, is saying, well, what happens if the risk is below appetite? And it goes back to Fiona's point earlier about the number of red risks. So one, your risk appetite moves. So there's no point having a risk appetite that says we can have nothing in double figures when you live in an environment as we do at the moment. But once you do that, it's, well, if something's above appetite and something else is below risk appetite, do we let that influence our strategy, our decision making, our focus as an organisation? Because if not, don't bother, because it's just a piece of paper that will sit in a drawer. It's got to have meaning, and that meaning has got to permeate at board level and in operational decisions. So it's an important document, and I think in the end, it's right that the board should, you know, both technically, if you look at the RBI and IA guidance, etc., but also in practical terms, if that's going to influence decision making and strategy and focus and everything else, it's important that the board as a whole is signed up to that, because you're going to be living with the consequences. So I think it's a very good point.
Patricia.
Thanks. Just a comment really, and you know, there's obviously comments within it about the senior leadership team and their risk management and appetite, and it's sitting alongside about 26 months of constant management of risk, changing risk across a day, between a day, across weeks, and our activity around that to establish a control centre early, the gold silver command structures. We were managing that risk and changing risks really quite fluidly, and you know, I accept the comments in the report, perhaps we weren't formally sitting down with a risk specific risk papers or whatever at SLT other than the normal churn, but it's just a comment really on the experience of probably more acutely being reactive and responsive and anticipating some of the risks in the system as we moved through the pandemic. You know, the use of PPE, the changing guidance, infection prevention and control, trying to keep our services going. So it's just how you know, I'm thoughtful about how we join that up, because it was probably a time that we've been much more focused around risk, but actually that's not translating in this audit findings. So I'll reflect on that.
No, I think that's fair comment. It was obviously an incredibly unusual period, and decisions had to be taken in very short order, and I think that does lead to different processes, which is fair enough. I think this is more about looking forward and the risk appetite that we're willing to take as we get into more normal times, if that's the right word. Tony, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point Patricia makes, but I think it's that interface between the operational. I mean, there's a lot of work, Langland's, there's all sorts of governance stuff that says governance, and particularly the role of the board members, is about the strategic. But that strategic influences the operational, and the operational should feed up to the strategic. I mean, again, all these things link. So when Patricia and her team are making those decisions, I think it's helpful that the board has kind of set the overall framework. So even within a changing context, and it was very fast moving, having a set of ground rules that make it clear what your priorities as a board are, help inform those operational things. And then we're also saying, well, obviously day to day, no one's going to be sitting there in the middle of a crisis saying, by the way, let's update our strategic risk register this morning. But over a period, over a cycle, you would want the cumulative effect of those operational decisions, of those greater understanding of operational risks, to permeate the strategic risk register. So it is about that difference between the kind of quotidian, daily, immediate, exigent stuff, and making sure that does eventually filter through into the more strategic, reflective work that really the board and particularly this audit committee deal with. So it's just making sure at some point we take a breath when you get a chance. It's okay, fine. What have we learned over the last 3 months? How do we make sure that you, as people who aren't involved in those day-to-day decision making and those day-to-day events, get a feel for what's been happening and how the organisation is responding, and the chance to influence that in a more strategic way. So it's about that interface. So we were fully aware of the operational stuff, but it was very much from that strategic governance perspective of an IJB, which is essentially strategic, and I suppose also links to that idea of directions. And there's quite an interesting discussion to be had about what happens if your risk appetite and the risk appetite of the operational partners is slightly different. There isn't an easy answer to that, but it's important to understand that, because in the end, you're giving directions that set that, and indeed should be finding out whether they're being implemented. So it does matter to have these kind of, and that's the difference between what Patricia's doing with daily with her operational hats on, and then in this environment, it's a slightly different discussion, which is helpful. And it's also probably helpful that we don't have it very often. But, once every 6 months is probably the time to take a deep breath and think back and look forward. And that's probably what this report is saying. So it's and just one thing for those that are on the health board, the report was originally written a year ago. So the committee assurance principles have changed slightly. If anyone's obsessed enough to look at there are some technical differences.
Yeah, aware of that. Okay, so we know the IJB needs to set risk appetite at some point. I think we'll leave Patricia and her team to think about the best way to have that discussion. That's not something we're going to agree on today. Were there any other questions or issues anyone wanted to raise in relation to the report? Okay, can we agree that then? Thank you. That's us at the agenda, at the end of the agenda then. Is there any other business anyone had to raise? No. So in closing, Isabel, can I just thank you for your work over the years in supporting the committee. It's been great working with you, and Tony, look forward to working with you in future. Okay, thanks very much everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.